Welcome to another lesson, the third one in the volumetric effects series. Like all lessons from the last module, it will be very practical. We'll approach the sunset scenario, which on a basic level won't be too different from the first sunset we did. However, there will be a small twist related to volumetrics here. In the previous lesson, we literally painted with different volumetric fogs, but now we are going to do it all in full 3D. We will learn, for example, how to make that volumetrics close to the ground and how to introduce some nuance that makes it not uniform everywhere. We will learn how to set it all up and tell you how to do it without killing the scene, or at least not to kill it right away. Just like in the previous lesson, we are dealing with visualizations that require both artistic and technical approaches. We'll make a scenario and at the same time, we'll throw some production issues here and there. Because, as is usually the case with volumetrics, it's best to learn everything while working on examples. So here we go. Let's click Interactive and see what our scene looks like so far. This time we have already introduced a few elements up front and they are very similar to what we did in the sunset scenario. This time it's a sunrise, but basically it can be any lighting scenario where we have some directional light. Nevertheless, creeping fogs will thematically suit the morning best. So we're going to make a very quick breakdown of the most important parameters that are in the scene. We've done it a few times at this point. I mean inserting HDRI, building depth, and working with color ranges. If it hasn't clicked yet, we encourage you to try it and at some point it will become second nature. We have set a scene with HDRI from PG Skies 720 from our database, but either of Sunset one included in this training will work. We have set it to 2 slots, one for illumination and the other one a little darker for direct visibility. They both have gamma lowered down a little, and that's the same thing we did in the sunset scenario. We have put a few trees here to cast a shadow on the foreground. And we have boxes behind the camera to cut off some of that light. And that's it when it comes to the lighting setup. As we can see, for now, the scene has a killer contrast because we haven't started tone mapping at this stage yet. And in this scene, I would like to do something new. That is to disable the ACES operator. And we see that the scene looks better right away. Let's try to do this scene basically without any tone mapping operator. I mean, without ACES or Filmic. We generally want to show that these are not some magic buttons that must always be pressed, but simply something that helps us quickly organize tonal ranges. As we can see, a portion of the sky is overexposed a bit, so we'll lower the exposure and just add a curve. This way, we can manually set the ranges. We definitely need to raise it here, maybe lower it a bit here, and basically we have done the range mapping just as we wanted, in a trivial way. We've got the whites covered and all the important blacks protected. This scenario has this strong tonal contrast, so I think this should suit our needs. And we could also add a little more vignette here. We don't usually do the vignette in 3D because it's always better to have the freedom to add it in post-production, where it's of course easier to add it, and then to remove it if we need. But you only live once, so I think the vignette will be quite significant in this image, so we'll probably add it in 3D anyway. Okay, so we have the base set up. Now we are going to start adding some extra spice to it. And we'll be adding the fog up first, and it's going to be quite a satisfying task. You will see it in a minute. Then we will move on to the haze in the foreground, and at the end, add volumetrics behind the building in the forest to glue everything together in a sense. So let's cut and isolate the mountains from the scene, so it's easier to work and make decisions. And generally enjoy the view because everything will look cool. So let's set a box where we will place the fog. Local box over the mountains. We have done it many times. We want the whole mountain to be in it. Well, it can actually be much higher. And of course, we make sure it's not including the camera itself. It can be huge because we will additionally determine the shape of a mist with maps. So the fog won't be all over the box, but just in a part of it. So the actual size of this box doesn't matter here. It could be bigger, but it won't affect anything. It won't affect rendering times, and it's better to make it too big than too small. Okay, so now we need to apply a Corona volume material to it, just as before. Let's set some arbitrary value, and with this scenario, we want to set directionality higher because it's just an attractive direction for it. The fog is not visible now because the camera happens to be inside the volumetric box. So let's push the box further away from the camera. Let me turn off the interactive and double check the position of the camera. Okay, now it's definitely away from the camera and our building. Let's isolate the mountains and start interactive again. Okay, so at this point we have a fairly uniform fog, which in this lighting and with this directionality looks pretty cool. But now we are going to add a special trick here and limit how it's displayed. We'll add a map in the absorption, and it will determine where the fog appears and where it does not. We'll add a map here, a corona distance. And a peculiar message pops up. Distance, no objects. That's because we don't have any object for the map to take distance from. So we have to click on this area. Well, it's better now. I mean, we don't have a message anymore. But still, nothing's happening because we haven't set everything up yet. Generally, corona distance will activate the fog at a certain distance from the given objects, as its name would suggest. Like everything in the subject, it's best to show it on an example. At the moment, the distance is 100 centimeters. We need to set it to 10,000 for something to happen. If this parameter is too low, we may not see it above the treetops at all. If it's too high, we'll lose this attractive contrast of misty valleys and dark silhouettes of hills, at least as we expect to see it. And there are no perfect settings here, and every scene will be different. And just to have some freedom in it, we need to solve one technical problem first, because you can easily make volumetric objects that will crash 3ds Max or render infinitely. This way, it would of course be impossible to do any tests or develop the look. Right now, we see a strange bar that doesn't correspond with what we would expect. And that's because we have volume mapping on the surface instead of inside volume. And I can't change it in interactive because in the best case I won't see anything, and at worst it will just crash, so I will turn the interactive off. So far, mapping on the surface makes the gradient visible only on the side of the box, because it's only mapped on this side. And this side touches the ground somewhere far below what the camera sees, below our frame, so we don't really see anything. Only when we change it to inside volume, the volumetric will be rendered in the middle of the entire volume of the box. It will render dynamically and take into account the distance from the geometry of the mountain. And here we come to the first production problem, which is rendering time and memory management. And this will be even more of a problem in our case, with the mountains and the box that covers a gigantic area. To solve it somehow, we need to change the volumetric material step size. The default value here is 1 centimeter, and if you would run a render like this, 3ds Max would probably crash right away and you wouldn't even know what happened. So let's dive a little deeper into how to approach it. This area in our scene is about 135,000 centimeters by 135,000 centimeters. That's 1,350 meters. If the light falls into this object, it's scattered inside. It's what volumetric material does, right? I mean, the rays of the sun fall from one side and travel inside. And now, Corona can check their behavior with a certain accuracy. And as you can see, if you are to check the behavior of the rays every 1 centimeter, in the scene of the size of 135,000 of them, you'd need a huge amount of computing power and RAM. That's why 3ds Max is immediately like, no thanks, I don't even feel like showing you a message that's something wrong, I'm out of here. And every time we think about volumetric effects, we have to keep an eye on this parameter. And when you work with maps, you can be clever about it. You can estimate the initial value of this parameter and then tweak it. In general, you can think about what detail you want to have in this area, create an appropriate box, check its size, and keep it in mind for later. We can even peek at the size of this grid and see what's the smallest polygon there. And it will be something around 2 by 2, 3 by 3 meters. So in general, there is no need to set a value that's less than that at all, because the terrain alone won't give us that much information. Either way, do we need the final detail of 2000 centimeters or 20 centimeters? It's just good to start with something much larger so that Max doesn't give up on us. And my rule of thumb is to turn on the render elements volumetric pass and follow it, especially at the initial settings. I cut off all the distractions like the sky and direct lighting, and we can focus just on what interests us. And I start with the step size more or less with the value of the size of the entire object, which is a very large value. It's 135,000 centimeters, so let's start with 100,000 centimeters and see how it looks in interactive. We can change this value here, but let's leave it for now and see. We can see something interesting going on. First of all, we can see something. We can see how it reacts to the change in these values. And it's better now. We see that the fog isn't stuck to this mountain, so to speak. Something's going on here. So we switch to Volumetrics pass, and we see it even better. It already looks pretty good with the huge step size we have set. And when working in an interactive with an object this size, we surely have to wait a bit until the noise is gone. Then we will notice the details that interest us. If we want to make changes at this pace, we'll have to work on a lot of noise, and it's hard to make informed decisions. Okay, so like I said, we started with 100,000 centimeters, and now I decrease this parameter 2 times, more or less, with each iteration, and I look to see if there are any changes. So far, we can see that something is going on here. There's some additional separation of the layers. This area didn't change much, but there's a difference around here. This means that changing this parameter affects the quality of the render, simply because there's a difference. We will see what it's all about when we go into details, but for now, I just reduce it 2 times again and check if each change will make even more difference. When we stop seeing these differences, if we don't notice them anymore, it means that we have found an optimal point to land on. And take into consideration that it can be difficult to see the differences in interactive. You have to wait for the noise to go down each time. To make it easier, you can use the history. Let's wait a moment for the render to clean up a bit and move this image to history. So now we reduce the value by half, and we immediately get a comparison. We see that in the previous render there were some kinds of ridges of light, so to say, and now they are gone, so you can see that there is definitely a change. Now I can add this one to the history and reduce it by half again and compare the two. And now we don't see any changes anymore. There are no differences to those ridges like we saw just a moment ago, and basically they are both very similar. We have some noise left from the previous pass, but as far as the quality of those renders goes, it's very similar. And this is basically a sweet spot in our case. We stay with the previous value, it was 5000 centimeters, so maybe let's make it 4000 just to be safer. And this will be the value we are interested in, the optimal one that allows us to reduce render time while still giving us as much detail as we can get. Generally, it's best to look at all of this on fully rendered production images. So we are going to show you some tests we have prepared beforehand. I think it will be easier to grasp this whole concept, so I will disable the interactive. We can see the different variants for different step sizes, basically from 50 to 250 centimeters. As I said, it's the minimum significant value for the polygon grid in the mountains. 1000 centimeters, 2000, 4000, 12, 25 and 135,000, which is the size of the entire terrain with mountains. And as we can see, basically up to the value of 4000, it doesn't change how we read this volumetric. Maybe there's some micro details somewhere in those individual God rays, but you'd really have to look closely on it. And we can't actually say that this one's better and this one's worse. So basically, Up until 4000 centimeters, we don't lose a thing. On the other hand, look at rendering times. And I work on quite a powerful computer with 64 cores. However, with a step size of 50 centimeters, we had 3 hours to get down below 8% of noise. However, at 4000 centimeters, it was less than 13 minutes. So that's a major difference in rendering times, while there is no difference in how it looks. Next, we did a test for 12,000 centimeters and for 25,000 centimeters, which resulted in kind of ridges on the mountains. Here, this slope used to be quite uniform, but in these variants, we see that this rendering seems artificial and it's certainly suboptimal. Although in our scene we only see this top fragment of these mountains, so it probably wouldn't even be visible and we could get away with it. But here, for example, in this variant, we lose this nice readability of this shadow that this hill casts. It's like it disappears here, so it's out of the question for me. Here, with this variant, that's basically very comprehensive. It looks better as it doesn't have these artifacts and strange hills, but we don't have such a nice razor-sharp shadows that we had here. And we can also see that if we go above 12,000, the rendering times will increase, mostly because of the fog, which actually gets denser. So, it's thinner near the trees here, for example, and it's denser here. Rendering times go up a bit, but these are not major changes. So that's it for the technical stuff. As I mentioned, our method is to start with full size and keep reducing it by half until we get to the point where we don't see the difference. This way, we can find the optimal value that renders relatively quickly. It doesn't involve any guesswork. It's actually a very methodical procedure, and generally, these values will vary in each scene. It obviously depends on how close this object is, but also on its geometry. If these hills look different and were lit a little differently, it might probably turn out that this step size is too big, that we are losing something. So while you're at it, you have to figure it out yourself every time. And there are still these more artistic settings to be discussed. We may be able to evaluate them with the help of this set as well. So first, the distance between the fog and the mountain. That's the distance in Corona distance map. I have landed at the 5,000 centimeters for now, which is roughly 5 times the height of our tree. And that gave me a nice relationship between the misty valleys and those hills that are darker. That's more or less what I was looking for. Earlier, I started with 10,000 centimeters, and we see that with the values this high, we are getting closer to this full mist rather than something that lays in the valleys. We still see some hills here, but it's no longer this cool effect that we wanted to have. In return, with lower values, like 1.5 the height of the tree, the fog is almost invisible. Maybe it shows just somewhere around here. It gently lies on this ridge. There's a little more of it here, but it still doesn't fill the valleys, so for me, 5 times the height of the tree is spot on. And I think that in a scenario like this one, with forested mountains and hills, it's a pretty good value to start with. And the last setting is fog density. The distance in the Corona volume material is currently at 50,000, and I think this parameter is the most forgiving. It's easiest to correct it in post-production, and it's also the most self-explanatory. The fog can be just thinner or thicker, almost like milk, and at the highest values we hardly see the mountains themselves. That's pretty much it for the settings. There is no magic here, and you can approach it methodically. You should set it up to have relatively quick feedback in interactive on what you do. So start with the maximum value of step size and go down. And then there's the question of choosing these 2 parameters in the material. First of all, distance far. We can orient it relative to some objects that we have in the scene. I used a tree that is about 10 meters tall, so the distance is 5 times bigger than the tree. The issue of distance is simply an aesthetic. We don't want to make this parameter too dense or too thin, but I think it's the most forgiving one. You can always use render volumetric elements to boost it in post-production. Okay, that's pretty much it for those mountains. We can go back to our scene. We can take care of the box in the foreground, and we want the foreground to be covered with this floating mist as well. Of course, it will be on a completely different scale. We were talking about whole mountains before, and we are talking about several dozen meters now. We want to build an appropriate box. Again, remember that the camera cannot be inside. I will move it down. We can do something like this. The camera looks just over the box. We can start with the material that we had before. Now, of course, we'll have other objects that interest us in terms of this distance. We are not focused on the mountains anymore. We'll be interested in the area we have here. Of course, it's not one object anymore, but a few of them. So maybe I will start by setting it as display as box, so I won't accidentally select it. And I will click the elements that I want to include, one by one. So the terrain, the water here, maybe the stones. I'm not selecting all the elements individually because there are a bit too many of them here. I don't need the fog to adapt to each and every stone. Let's see what we have here. This thing is still missing. Maybe we can isolate it. I've selected water and I wanted to also select this. Now we have pretty much everything. I can pre-select all these objects except the volumetric material and add them here. And now it should work. We might as well look at it in interactive, where the scene is isolated this way. It will be easier and faster. So let's turn the interactive on. For now, I assume that these values are quite absurd. Because we have set them for the mountains, so we have to bring it all down. And now we see the fog in this area, more or less around these objects that interest us. We see that it spreads above them. But right now, as we look at it from a grazing angle, from up close, we actually see an unpleasant edge of the fog here. And that's a problem. Maybe let's try to lower the step size significantly and see if it will make a difference. But honestly, I don't think so. It may have gotten a little smoother, but that edge is still there. So at this point, we will use one more trick. We'll use another map to modify the volumetric, and it will be a noise map. And maybe we can simplify it even more. Maybe I will group these objects here and create a box like this, which will more or less correspond to the scale we are interested in. And I will isolate the box in the scene. We will try to set the noise based on this box, because if we're looking at this elongated object at a grazing angle, it's difficult to make some kind of educated guess there that would make some sense. So I think it's better to work on something abstract. And we will try to set up the scale of the noise now. And it's better to do it in the interactive. By the way, the things we see here are not always true in viewport for various reasons. We can see that the noise looks different here, so I prefer to set it up here. So as for the noise settings, I would choose fractal noise. It has a slightly smoky-like detail. And by narrowing the high and low ranges, say 0.8 and 0.2, we can increase this contrast between the dark and bright. I usually prefer to end up with something like this. It will be clear when we have this noise in the fog density distance. With smaller values, it may be hard to understand, and you can still play with the scale here if you want. And I think that's something we'd be interested in. Now, let's see what it looks like with noise here. I'm going to copy the volume material, and I will add noise to it instead of distance. Let's see how it works. All of a sudden, the fog is empty in some places and filled in others. That's more or less what I'm looking for here. But if you don't want so many empty spaces, you can raise the high value here, for example. You will get less of that pure white noise color this way, which means there is no fog there. And I really like it. You can increase the contrast a little bit by setting it to 0.7 and 0.3. But you know what? Let's stay with what we had before. I think it was better. By the way, you can check the step size. This box is around 600 by 600, so let's see how the step size works with noise. We see that in general with a different map, it might behave a bit differently, so let's just keep decreasing it by half. And at some point it won't matter anymore. I will add it to my history and compare it to 20. And it's quite similar. So now I'm going to add 20 and compare it to 40. It's still similar, so I will compare 40 with 80. And with 80 centimeters, I can already see that it is different, so I finally decide on 40. Perhaps we can change it up a bit because our box starts right under the camera, so we may want more of it. And we see that corona distance will probably work fine with the bigger step size than just 40. So we'll have to adapt to this noise map that may simply require a bit finer step size to make this detail stand out. In this example, we can clearly see a difference between mapping on the surface from mapping inside the volume. One is a noise superimposed on the box and nothing happens inside. The other is mapped in 3 dimensions, sort of spatially. Maybe it wasn't so obvious before, as we're looking at this giant object somewhere all over the mountains. Now this difference is quite noticeable. So we have set up this noise map, and we can remove this object now and isolate the group we had before. Let's see how this area functions in the scene with what we have just tested. So we have the same thing we did last time, and that's corona distance. And I will use the noise as a distance scale. Then this distance scale map changes the simple gradient between black and white, so corona takes into account the content of the map. If we add it here, we see right away that the whole area has changed. We don't have a flat gradient anymore, we rather have a turbulence typical to the fog. If we wanted, for example, to shift the fog in one direction, we could stretch this noise and give it a kind of tiling different than one. Maybe not in that direction. Generally, I'm trying to find an interesting look of this fog, which oftentimes involves going back and forth. I will check different options, but we will fast forward most of this section. And maybe we will apply a little tiling also here. It will be more interesting. I'm checking where it looks the most attractive. Maybe we will just turn it around. And maybe I will reduce the noise scale a bit, so it fits better. Or maybe just the opposite, and I will increase it. And we can also test increased contrast. And we still haven't changed one thing, which is that step size value. And we remember that this step size 40 turned out to be significant for noise. Okay, I think I'm happy with it. There was a lot of tweaking, but we still work around the values we've set previously. At least more or less, so it's not entirely random. We have the foreground set up. We can see how it looks in the context of the whole image. And at the very end, we will move on to creating a fog around the forest. And we can see it's pretty cool. Maybe I could tone down the noise a bit more. For example, I could increase it a little here. And reduce the contrast in the noise itself. Maybe I could also add the slope to the distance map. I don't like it that it stands out so much. So if I manage to add this slope and these stones on the left to the distance, I think it would be for the better. You know what? It's not so good after all. This box ends here, and suddenly there's this hard edge here because of this slope. So maybe we'll get rid of it. And this slope is called the ground foreground. Or we can simply add these stones here. I mean the smallest ones. I think that it will raise the fog a little, and at the same time it won't reach too high. Let's see what it looks like. And I think it's better now. I am also having a bit of a problem with this fog ending a bit abruptly. This edge should read more, but I also don't want to make this volumetric container bigger, because in this lighting it will look like some milk with these properties. I need something thinner, so I think I will just create another box for another thinner fog. Box which covers it all here. It might be higher, it won't bother us. And I will set it to display as box. Let's return to the materials. I'll copy this triad, but I'll definitely need completely different settings. These objects in corona distance surely interest me no more. I'm interested in this area here instead. I can increase step size to be on a safe side and see what it looks like. Oops. Here we have dependency loop, and I almost assigned this material to the terrain that is set here in corona distance. And of course I wanted to set it to the box. You will probably need to increase this value, so it makes more sense. we see it rises higher here. I am going back and forth between few parameters here, trying to make our last fog match the overall feeling between the fog in the foreground and the background. And okay, I think it's better. It's what we wanted, more or less. So now we see that the fog in the image builds foreground and midground and background, and it's stretched from the background to the foreground, and that's exactly what we wanted. And basically, all we need to do is to make the forest in the same way. We'll enclose it with a box. And now, the only problem may be that we don't have much to set corona distance to. Earlier, we had some natural areas around which this mist was supposed to float above. Now this area ends up in the middle of this box. And we'd like it to go on. So I will just make an additional auxiliary plane here and I will exclude it from rendering. It will serve just as an object we can dock the corona distance to. So I will copy this material and I will throw out what we had before once again. Add this new plane and try to assign this map to the object. Of course, the settings are incorrect again. The values are too small for anything to happen. So we have to increase them and keep looking. It can get in the way if this material goes too far to the right. And for example, we have a visible edge here. But then we can always reduce the plane at the bottom, for instance, and it will affect how we perceive it. If we push it back a little here, we should start losing this edge. We can still reduce the distance a bit. If we want to rise it, we can rise this plane. This way it will just go up a bit. Let's maybe see how it looks without noise. So the noise seems to change a lot in this perception. Maybe it's even a little distracting. So I'll try to set it up without noise for now. And I will add the noise later, only with much smaller contrast. Now it's a little closer to the normal gradient, but with some slight nuance. And that's basically how we set this scene up. We can render it, go to post-production and check what else we need here, and what we can change. But I think it's cool and you probably won't need to make any drastic changes. So, okay, I'm just going to turn on production layers and we can render. Perhaps I will change just one more thing. I changed my mind and I'm going to get these stones out of the fog because I feel that they lift it up and it's unnecessary. Okay, so let's render it again. So we can move on to post-production. We have a ready render, we have a pass of volumetrics, and I uploaded 2 more layers that we have created before in earlier scenarios. I'd like to make some masks out of them. Okay, so we can start working on this image. And the first thing I would do is manually address some things that annoy me. There aren't many of them. We got some lights here that I don't like too much. So I'm just going to darken them in a pretty brutal way. I will add a bit of noise here. Nothing special, it's not very big. We don't want to spend too much time on it. As for the rest, I think it's rather okay. We can add a bit of a vignette here. We've already added it in the frame buffer, but this begs for more, to be honest. Maybe let's change the opacity to make it a little weaker. Okay, it seems a little better. And now I'd like to do some haze behind the building, because we have the fog in the forest, in the foreground, in the background, and I feel that the silhouette of this tree would come out better if we add some more haze. So I will create a layer under our vignette and just use a soft brush to draw it here on normal blending. Or maybe not on normal, we'll do it on lighten, so as not to obscure something by accident. And let's crop it according to this mask. So let's go into channels, hold Ctrl and left click on the green channel and invert this selection. So we managed to put a mask on this tree. We still have one plant that didn't get caught in this mask, so maybe I will take it from this wire color. and I will paint it black. There is still one piece hidden here. And it should be. We have raised this piece up and the silhouette of the tree came out a little better. Okay, the next thing I would do here are just some slight adjustments to the curves. Let's raise the whites a bit and lower the blacks. But literally a tiny change that will give it a little more punch. As for that haze, maybe we can desaturate it a bit. I think that this color is too much. Okay, we are left with just a few elements. We could add some bloom to the light that appears in the sky. I will copy all these layers and merge them into one. And give it a Gaussian blur, so it's pretty blurry altogether, but it doesn't lose all its readability. Now we can put it in screen mode. Let's go to blending options and we'll choose a setting that affects only the brightest areas. Additionally, we can add a mask to it and remove bloom from those areas where we don't want it. Primarily, we want it to show up somewhere here. Let's maybe soften this area a bit more. This is also just a touch, but I feel like it adds some nuance. Finally, I'd like to add some more selective colors here. Mainly the blue ones in the sky. I'd like to turn them to the greener side, the cyan side. Maybe get rid of that blue completely and go for a little more stylized look. I will try to add a bit more of this vignette from the left, this time on normal blending. Just a bit to make this tree fade away even more. When it comes to this volumetric layer, I think there is no need to add anything more here. We could take some information from it, like about this forest, and we could, for example, draw it on the screen. Let's paint the whole mask black and check what we've got. We can see that we can expose the building silhouette with it, which isn't bad at all. But maybe not that intense. Maybe even a little less. It helps a little with the readability of the building itself. So I think we don't need to do anything else here. It seems that this image works just as it should. What can I say? Another practical lesson behind us. We hope you like this module and you are inspired to try volumetric effects yourself. We know that the machine can kneel a bit in some cases, but we shared some good practices that should make your life a little bit easier. So you are not wandering in a fog, literally speaking. We have another color analysis ahead and can't wait to see you there. Thank you and see you soon.